Investments come in all shapes and sizes, and on this channel, I typically cover the more conventional ones. Of course, your stocks, your fixed income, things of that nature. But one area that has really kind of taken over personal finance, I'd say, in the past year and has really brought up some good discourse is the value of a college degree. And a college degree kind of has the aspects of everything you love about investments. It has an upfront cost, it gives a future flow of cash flows, and then you can discount it back to the present to figure out whether or not it's worth it. But this is a conversation that has been running rampant recently as to whether or not college degrees are still worth it in 2026. And so, in today's video, I kind of wanted to discuss how I view this framework and how I think a lot of people would benefit viewing my framework. And then, additionally, I kind of want to cover some of the common narratives, both on one end of the spectrum, you have your college is a scam, and on the separate end, you have everybody should be going to college. And then finally, I'll kind of give a little bit more of some discussion and insights into how I feel we improve this conversation and better for the future. So, first things first, let's discuss how I try to view the worthiness of a college degree in 2026. So, of course, I'm a finance major, and I think typically, on my perspective, I view this as almost like an NPV calculation. What that means is each individual person is going to have a, well, different formula to try and figure out whether or not a college degree would be worth it in their case. And basically, what you do is you add up your full upfront cost. Of course, you have the typical costs associated with college, but you have to keep in mind a lot of people are going to have to take out loans. They're also going to be sacrificing years they could be working in, albeit maybe an underpaying field relative to what they get after, but whatever the case, you need to add up all of the costs. Then, what you're going to do is, after you have your college degree and you're ready to work, you're going to figure out how many years you're going to work. For a lot of people, this is like 40 or something in that ballpark. What you would then do is you would then take the difference of the amount you would have been paid in a field where you didn't need a college degree and what you would have might be tried ending up working as versus the payments you receive annually for that career with the college degree. So you would take the differences, you would add up the sum of all the differences for the years of work, and then you would discount it back, probably using a guesstimate of inflation. And that would be a very clear and concise way to try and figure out the value of a specific degree. Now, of course, when I raise that argument as to how I try and view what a college degree in 2026 is worth, you might be left with a lot of questions. And I think that's going to kind of highlight why I think this conversation isn't a clear cut black and white answer. It's much more of a gray area. So, first things first, let's cover the simple limitations that make it really hard to give a one or the other answer. Well, for starters, we'd have to estimate what the future annual earnings we'd have would be for our entire working life. This is obviously difficult, and you're probably going to be living two drastically different lives depending on whether or not you opt for the college degree versus whatever you can get without the college degree. Additionally, you have some factors in there that don't necessarily fit into a monetary value. So, for some people who really do have a passion and they really want to say, you know what, I don't care if I'm making less, my calling is to be a zoologist. I know I could make more money in a different field, but I love working with animals and it would impact my life and drastically improve my quality of life. You can't necessarily assign a specific monetary value. You might be able to guess, or you might be able to look at your specific calculation and figure out whether or not the cost that would have been all of your future strings of cash flows and those differences and the cost for getting that degree and pursuing that path would still be worth it. And that might be something you could do. But obviously, there are going to be limitations on guessing the quality of life and trying to assign a monetary value to that. So, where does the typical conversation and maybe the two ends of the spectrum, the biggest arguments, where do those kind of go wrong? Well, for me, it's a pretty simple thing. It's that we highlight and give voices to the most outlandish of claims on either side. And unfortunately, in 2026, college has become, let's just face it, a politicized issue heavily, right? We have different narratives, and anytime something becomes politicized, you're going to get two very, very extreme takes. And most of these takes kind of struggle from, well, it's similar issues. It's anecdotal evidence and it's also picking out outliers. So even if we were to just take the conversation as a whole, right? The numbers would show that on average, you're better off pursuing the college degree. That's just the on average. That is what the studies cite. That being said, you can still have outliers on both people who didn't get degrees and then became wildly successful and rich, and people who went about getting these degrees and they weren't worth it and they were low paying degrees and they ended up making significantly less than had they just avoided all of those costs and the degrees altogether, right? And these arguments tend to fixate on those specific instances. They don't take the conversation as a whole or think about it practically. It is no, it's one end or the other, and we're going to pick and choose which ones fit our narrative, and we're going to leave out the rest of the conversation that doesn't fit our narrative. Furthermore, even if we were going to discuss the general takeaway, right? The general takeaway being yes, you should get a college degree if you were going to go 100% yes or no, right? If we were going to take that, there's still going to be degrees and there's still going to be ways to get those degrees that are going to be incredibly unworth it and very cheap, wonderful alternatives that'll give you positive ROI almost immediately. Just because something is one way or the other, if you made it a yes or no, which is kind of silly to do, doesn't mean that there don't exist multiple different pathways from that decision that kind of make it murkier. So, overall, a lot of the problems boil down between making it a black and white answer and not a gray area where it arguably should be. Now, additionally, where the argument can go wrong is in the alternative section. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of different pathways to go. And typically, people will just pick and choose the ones that, again, fit their narrative, if whether or not, yes, everybody should go, or no, nobody should go, and it's a massive scam. So, on the no, nobody should go, they always kind of bring up like the idea of, oh, just go into the trade schools, right? And this alternative, yes, a lot of the times it can be cheaper, but a lot of people would be shocked to see it can still be kind of close depending. It's not exactly a, oh, this is just a free alternative, especially if you bring up people getting scholarships or things of that nature. Again, muddying the waters, making it gray. It's not just an easy, yes, everybody should go to trade school instead. And on the flip side, you have, oh, you could spend a couple of years in community college and then transition. So you could do all of the classes that you don't really want to focus on and like your general credits at a community college for much cheaper and then go on. And while that certainly is true, you also run the risks of colleges not wanting to accept all of those credits depending on where you want to go. And of course, in a similar sense, community college is still expensive. Yes, it's less expensive, but it can still be expensive if you're not getting scholarships and depending on where you live. So now let's discuss kind of some of the popular narratives and we'll take a closer examination at each of the two arguments, those being college is a scam and everyone should go to college. So starting up, let's focus on the college is a scam crowd. And again, typically when you hear these conversations, they are going to be hyper fixated on instances where people have done really, really well for themselves without college degrees. A lot of them, it's themselves, they make it about themselves. And a lot of the times, it'll also fixate on people who went after very low paying degrees and went about it in completely impractical ways. So they'll be like, but have you heard about these people who went to private school out of state who then picked up gender studies degrees? And that'll typically be the conversation point on that front. Or on the flip side, it'll be, yeah, but you could just pick up a commission sales job or do door to door sales where you don't necessarily need a degree and you can make a significant living for yourself going that route. And again, these conversations try and apply one person's individual life onto everybody else. And it doesn't exactly work like that. Like, for instance, just going with the examples I gave. The person who went out of state, who then went to private school to then get a degree that would pay significantly less, right, is obviously not going to be ideal or practical to the average person. It's just not an instance that most people, if they were given that path or trajectory, would be like, yes, this is worth it for me. And yeah, there are a lot of people who don't think out those actions, but I'm not going to be able to say with 100% confidence that they didn't. Now, I might have my own opinions and be like, based on what I've heard in this situation, it sounds like there were probably alternatives to do this much cheaper, and they chose a really expensive one. But it's not really my place to sit there and be like, this is the stupidest thing ever, because maybe they had to go to a specific one because they wanted to go work in a very, very niche area, right? That's not like how I would choose to go about my life, and most people wouldn't choose to go about their life like that. And hopefully, that person thought long and hard about the conversation and understood fully what they were trading off by doing that. But that wouldn't be what the average person would do, which is why it kind of doesn't fit the narrative that this is what the average college kid does. And then, second, on the you can do incredibly well, you can do commission based jobs, you can do all these things, you can start your own app, you can do your own software, yada, yada, yada. When you look at those stories and why those stories work so well, it's because the people behind them were truly, really passionate about what they were doing. You don't hear a lot of stories about people who had zero desire whatsoever, who were lazy people, or who weren't passionate about going and doing those things, who then decide, you know what, I'm just going to become great at this. That's typically not how that story goes. They can definitely start off doing that and then realize, oh, hey, I actually am very passionate about this. I like learning sales. I like talking to people. I like figuring out how I can lay in my selling points and how I can stand out and differentiate myself. Those are going to be the types of people who succeed in that. The average person in the workforce may not necessarily have the drive and desire to thrive in other unrelated things to what they're passionate about. And that's kind of where that argument would fall apart is you'd see a mass crowding in of if everyone went that route, right? And everybody becomes a door-to-door salesman, you'd see a massive uptick in competition. And sure, maybe you could still differentiate yourself from the crowd, but it'd be a lot harder for you. And additionally, all the people you've told, hey, you can go make this great living here, and they wouldn't be passionate, they wouldn't want to improve, and they wouldn't want to pick up the skills necessarily to make that great life for themselves. Similarly to flesh out focusing on the most expensive ways to get the most useless degrees, I typically don't hear conversations from people who have this narrative and try and have these conversations where they're like, yes, this person went to an in state school and got an accounting degree that then paid off in 3 to 4 years. Like, it's never the case where it's going to be cited as a high paying degree, unless of course, we're talking about very expensive ways to go and become a doctor, where there's a significant quantity of expenses in that conversation, and you have to wait a very long time for that to pay off. Yes. But it's very uncommon to hear the conversation be from this crowd, oh, they went through this the practical way and they got a really good degree that would actually pay off. Which, again, if you're going to pick one side or the other, black or white, this is the case, all college kids are getting scammed or whatever, you can't have outliers. That disproves your point. And similarly to what I'll get into, if you have the conversation of, oh, everybody in the first world country should be getting education, it's their human right, and you have instances on the other side that kind of disprove, and it's like, oh, the average person doesn't actually know what they want to do at that age, and they also don't get degrees relevant to what they got the training and experience and knowledge in, then it kind of blows apart your argument. And my last point on the college is a scam crowd. Because this is a highly politicized issue, if you've been on a college campus, you're going to understand what I'm going to discuss. But basically, you're always going to have these types of people who will show up to your campus. They'll have their signs, they'll have their bullhorns, they'll be screaming and making a big commotion, and they're telling you you're going to be getting brainwashed to become a major liberal by going to that school. And that's not necessarily a generalization. It's something I've gone through multiple times now in my experience at college, where you have people who show up, you have them scream at you through bullhorns and wave their little signs. And I'd understand this conversation if you were going to specifically schools that kind of branded themselves that way and everything, but there'll be people who just like park outside our business building and do this. And I'm not sure if people have really met a lot of people who typically go to business school, or even if you want to like talk about some of the things that are, I don't know, taught in business school. A lot of economists, a lot of people in finance, they wouldn't be considered super liberal people. And when you hear their opinions on how they discuss the world and things of that nature, they kind of combat those narratives. I think economics does more of a job than this than some of the other schools do. But you'll see a lot of the teachings aren't exactly, oh, liberal brainwashing, and it's kind of like a lousy stupid argument. Personally, it's just a little bit of a gripe on my end, where it's like, no, in actuality, free market capitalism and learning about why it's actually a pretty good thing and how you can operate and actually work and improve in that isn't going to fit under the category. So it's a little bit of a nonsensical thing to be like, oh, there are certain degrees and majors you can get at a college that maybe would lean one way or the other, like no dir kind of ones. So therefore, we need to kind of gripe and fuss at people when it's like, no, there are majors that fit more with certain crowds, right? Like, obviously, and this is again common arguments you hear, people who get a gender studies degree are going to be more left leaning on average. I feel quite confident just making that statement out loud, right? Whereas maybe people in construction or forestry or whatever you want to, something is probably going to lean more right. You're going to find that in basically anything. It's almost like friend groups, where if you picked friend groups who talk about gender and liberal issues, yeah, they're probably going to lean more left. That doesn't mean everyone at the school leans left, or if you just focused in on certain fields where people are more likely to be conservative, it wouldn't mean, oh, everyone here is conservative. So those types of arguments are kind of nonsensical and don't really add to the conversation. All right, now let's go to the other end of the spectrum. The everyone should be sent to college. It's typically thrown in with a first world countries, they need to learn, they need to specialize. Education's a human right, and all of us need to go to college. And that is a narrative that gets thrown around. It gets thrown around in media, it gets thrown around in different news, it gets thrown around pretty much everywhere. But it's definitely not true. And I think a good thing that shows this is the fact that almost 80% of people end up switching their major. Which, again, you're telling 18-year-olds, and I say 18-year-olds because typically that's the narrative pushed in a lot of media that even discusses people going to college, is it's 18-year-olds who then go to college, right? That's kind of the traditional view on that, right? You're telling these people who a lot of times have never once thought about what they want to do with their future, what they want to do with their life, to pick something to specialize in right that instance, and that's going to become the rest of their life. And the statistics would show they don't do a good job picking, right? They don't do a good job thinking through years down the road. They're thinking, oh, how can I go to this school where I can party and meet people? And this is my first taste of freedom, rah. And of course, you're going to have people who definitely have thought about that for years and they know what they want to do and they go and they do that. And that's awesome for them. But that's not the average story. Also, despite the mainstream narrative on this being, hey, you go in at 18 years old and you come out with your bachelor's degree at 2022, that is not the case for the average person. The average person graduates with their bachelor's at 24 to 25. So they do a 6-year time frame for their 4-year degree. Again, this could help be explained with switching of majors. I know some people, it's a simple switch of, oh, it's these two things that are pretty related. I'm in the same building or college, and yeah. But for some people, that's not the case, and they switch drastically, or they fail classes, or whatever the case. I think this shows that, again, for a pathway that is a standard 4 year degree, and honestly, nowadays, a lot of schools are doing 3+1s. If it's taking you 6 years to do a 4 year degree, you're probably too, like, you probably didn't think ahead on what you wanted to do, or you had to make a decision at 18 and you chose poorly. And I don't think that fits into what you would want college to be, especially when we complement that with my next little discussion point, the fact that only 27 to 41% of adults have jobs that are related to their degree. So, in instance, we've done a poor job forcing people to pick at 18 years old what they want to do with the rest of their lives, and then they don't even end up following through on that. Like, again, it's very dependent down to the study as to what that exact percentage is. That's why I gave a range, because those were the ones that typically came up when you look up that question. But overall, the conversation being, people are obviously not making the most practical decision with what they want to do. They aren't even ending up in jobs that are necessarily related to that. And so why are you trying to push the narrative that everyone should be going to college? It doesn't make sense. Now, let's talk about the common sense fixes that I kind of see to the overall discourse. My first thing should be that college should be emphasized after you've truly, and I mean truly, decided what you want to do with your life and the types of fields and jobs you want to be working in. It makes no sense to basically pay up, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars, paid off loans, go through multiple years of giving up an income and be rewarded with a degree and learning and experience in something that you have no desire to do. That should not be at all a good outcome for anyone. It should be okay, and when I say okay, for some people it is, but I mean, there shouldn't be negative connotations behind taking a few years working, figuring out what it is exactly you want to do, and then pursuing the education so it actually pays off and benefits after you've kind of completed your degree path. That should be a good, easy conversation to have. My second common sense fix would be to kind of eliminate the idea that every single person needs to go to college. There are definitely people who benefit greatly from going to college. There are definitely people who don't benefit from going to college, and they don't really know what they want to do, and they're doing it to make people happy and make them proud of them, and suddenly they're in a bunch of debt and not working in a field they even want to work in, and they're having a miserable quality of life. We need to be okay with this middle ground where it truly is, hey, the people who understand what they want to go ahead and do with their lives, and they know it's going to pay off and their decision is going to be a good one long term, should be allowed to go do that. And we shouldn't push that same exact narrative on people who have no idea what they want to go do, and we make them go figure out what they want to do in a very expensive way when there are much better alternatives to that. And finally, go back to the simple formula decision making tree that I kind of talked about. Again, it has limitations, but it truly is a way to framework it and make it an individual conversation. If somebody wants to go focus and get a degree in something that is going to, well, not pay off in the future, have that conversation. Understand, hey, these are the cold hard numbers, or at least a guesstimate of the cold hard numbers. Is my passion really worth me sacrificing this amount of money? And for some people, it absolutely will be. Maybe going after that passion makes it so it doesn't feel like work to them, and they'd be willing to work more years into the future to have the same quality of life in retirement. Or maybe when we throw out the word passion, they actually really are. They aren't just like what you tell when 18-year-old tells you they want to do for the rest of your life. It truly is something that brings meaning to them, and they are worth giving up that. But that is a conversation that needs to be had. Overall, thank you for checking out my video. This was a really interesting conversation for me to kind of have and figure out and discuss my major talking points. I think it's a thing that a lot of people, they just kind of pick one end or the other, and it leaves everyone in the middle who typically would view it from more of a rational standpoint, going, huh? What are you saying? And I think this is a good way to kind of demonstrate that and get people to think about these types of conversations. So overall, thank you very much for checking out my video. I really appreciate your time.